now I kind of want to go into like the definition of masculinity in like modern society or contemporary society. Do you think that there needs to be like a redefining of what it is, or more kind of like a like return to what masculinity was? Like let's say 100 years ago, where there is this more like rough and gruff kind of idea of what a male is. Or do you think there needs to be a marriage between the two?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'll say is that masculinity, even more than femininity, is always under social construction. It's always being reinvented and devised. It's somewhat more of a social construction than femininity is.
Hmm.
And every society has had to grapple with the question of defining and encouraging mature masculinity. So encouraging that transition from boy to man, which requires some thought being given to kind of, well, what does that consist in, right? What does masculinity kind of look like today? And so I worry a bit about, because right now there's so much uncertainty about that question. And as I say, there's always a question mark next to masculinity. It's just a question of how bold and big that question mark is. And right now it seems pretty big and pretty bold. There's a lot of uncertainty right now. And there's a lot of negativity around it too. So perhaps it's worth saying just briefly that I think the most important thing to do is to abandon terms like toxic masculinity and not pathologize masculinity. Right? So first, do no harm, I think would be important. That gives space then for the conversation, which isn't immediately framed in negative terms. Right? I think the idea of saying to men that our goal for you is to not be toxic is not a very inspiring message, and it's why toxic masculinity has been so profoundly unhelpful. But on the more positive side, I think the challenge is to say, look, what is it that on average tends to be more associated with masculinity and masculine traits, and how do they work in contemporary society? And most importantly, how do they fit with a world of gender equality? Like, so how can we say, for example, fathers do things a little bit differently to mothers on average? There's a lot of stuff they do the same, but some stuff they do differently. Fathers, for example, do more play, and more kind of rough and tumble play, more kind of managed risk-taking play, more social scaffolding out into the world with their kids. They do a bit more of that than mothers on average, right? Not better, not worse, equal important. And so it's things like that. It's things like the greater propensity towards risk-taking. I'll just take that as one example where there is pretty clear evidence that seems to vary, and not just for social reasons. We're not just socialized into that. Right? Mm-hmm. Is it good or bad that men, or that masculinity is associated with higher levels of risk-taking? The answer is yes, it is good and bad. It depends. Right? Mm-hmm. We want risk takers in our society, but we don't want teenage boys taking crazy risks that might end up ruining their lives. Right? And so the challenge here is, how do we kind of create a conversation that's respectful enough of those differences without putting them onto some sort of pedestal, recognizing it's all on distribution and overlaps, and just kind of relax about it. I think what's interesting right now is this conversation is much more fraught than it needs to be, at least in the kind of culture war circles that we move in. And so you see this on the progressive left, this sense of like masculinity being A, totally socialized, and or B, totally bad, right? And just a world without masculinity. We're like just really struggling to come up with a positive definition of masculinity. And when they try, it sounds a lot like traditional femininity. And when you point that out, they say, oh, yeah, it probably is. So when you say, no, what's specific to masculinity that's good? Really struggle with that, because they don't want to say stuff that you say. So you're saying women can't take risks? You're saying women can't be competitive? No, we're not saying that. So what are you saying? But then I think partly as a result of our failure to have a good conversation about this, I see a lot of people on the reactionary right saying we should go back to the way things were. When men were men, women knew their place. He was the head of the household. He was a provider and a protector. And you're like, I'm sorry. I don't know how you would wave that magic wand anyway and go back, but it's profoundly unhelpful advice to young men. And so a lot of young men feel like they're being told on the one hand that they should be more like their sister, and they are told on the other hand they should be more like their father or grandfather. Mm. And they are negotiating a very different world to the world that their fathers and grandfathers negotiated, and for largely good reasons, because of the rise of women. But they also don't want to be women. They don't want to be like their sister. They're different to their sister. And so somewhere between those two, we've lost a lot of men.